Thank you, Ivy. Next up is the What is Open group.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name's Stephen Hill. I'm Head of Research Policy at the Higher Education Funding Council for England, and I have the privilege of presenting the final presentation from the What is Open working group. So I'll ask my colleagues from the group to introduce themselves, starting at that end.
Susan Haig from CARL, Canadian Association of Research Libraries.
Alicia Wise from Elsevier.
I'm Seth Denbo from the American Historical Association.
Martin Kalfatovic from Smithsonian Libraries.
Catherine Murray Ross, Georgia Tech.
Rick Anderson, University of Utah.
Okay, and we have a couple of colleagues who have had to leave early, who were in the group, and you can find their names in the list in the program. So what you got yesterday from this group was the preprint, and what you're about to hear, I hope, is the version of record. So we were tasked with this question of what is open, and that's a question that on one level leads you into the notion of definitions, but we didn't go in that direction, and we went into quite a different place. And I think what we are going to propose, so let's cut to the chase, is that we need to develop a framework for better expressing how open something is, and to enable scholars to chart a path through the world of openness. So before we start, a bit of context. Why do we care about open was our really our initial thought, and we focused on the fact that openness can contribute to better research, greater impact, and help us deliver more value for money for the investment that goes into research. Why better research? Openness can lead to more effective or more scrutiny of research, easier replication of research, and research products can become the inputs to further scholarship and further work, and that was a key point that was raised in the questions yesterday. Why do we think it creates greater impact? Well, that's quite straightforward. Somebody's already mentioned the idea that the more eyeballs there are on something, the more effective that is, and that's basically the idea here, that the greater impact comes from more users being able to access the content. Our second point is that we think that defining open or thinking about how open you are needs to apply to all aspects of the research process, outputs of all sorts, products of all sorts, and the research process itself. So it's not just confined to journal articles and data sets, but is much broader than that. And our key message is that for our group, openness is a spectrum property. It's not a yes or no question, it's not a binary. There are degrees of openness in almost any area that you look at, and we consider there to be 4 important areas that I'll come onto in a minute. And when you're thinking about implementation around those dimensions of openness, then there are a number of factors, including disciplinary values and cultures and practices, types of output, goals, and practical considerations that all need to be considered as you chart your way through this open landscape. So what we're proposing is the idea of an open spectrum. And what we mean by that is a landscape, as I say, of quantitatively different places that you can end up. And what was pointed out to us in the Twitter comments and a helpful email yesterday is that there are some other frameworks that look a bit like this, the SPARC plus What is Open guidelines. But we think what we're proposing is actually quite distinct from that, because that focuses on journals. Journals are actually quite a problematic space to actually answer the question, what is open? But focusing down on outputs and products and process of research gets you into a better space. Our view of this open spectrum is that there's not, that there are different places that you can be in this landscape of open, and there is no right or wrong. It's for individual scholars and research funders and institutions to decide how they want to chart their path through this open landscape. So we identified 4 dimensions of open, which are listed on here: discoverability, accessibility, reusability, and transparency. And we think these can be brought together in a framework which we're going to christen today as the DART framework. For every good working group needs an acronym. The DART framework. Some of my working group colleagues may be a little bit surprised by that. There was an email exchange between a few of us literally 5 minutes ago when we came up with the acronym. So the DART framework is what we're talking about. By discoverable, we need mean there needs to be good metadata available on the public internet, that research objects need to be linked, that we need persistent and unique identifiers, and clear right statements. What can you do with the content is just as important as being able to find it. Some level of discoverability is part of a baseline conversation about openness. The second element is accessibility. We see, again, within our baseline openness idea, the requirement for content to be free to all users at the point of use and in perpetuity. But then there are a number of other features of accessibility that can also contribute to the extent to which an object is open. Is it readable by people regardless of disability? Is it downloadable and copyable? Is it machine readable? And how soon is it accessible? And the earlier something is accessible, the more open it is. The third element is reusability. This is pretty simple. We think that the fewer the restrictions that are placed on the use of content, the more open it is, and that's to do with licensing and permissions. And finally, and I think this is an important point which we didn't have time to dwell on too much yesterday, is the idea of transparency of the research process being an important and essential component of openness. We need transparency in peer review. We've already heard from the peer review group in that context. We need transparency of research metrics, and we think there are some really useful areas that have already been explored in for example, the top guidelines, looking at different attributes, different metadata requirements, if you like, that are needed to make research truly open. And finally, there's the idea of author transparency, assessing roles to authors, understanding exactly who they are and using unique identifiers to do that, information about funding and so on. And this transparency aspect of openness, I think, is a really important one when it comes to really getting the benefits, particularly benefits back into the research system. So where next with this activity? Well, we're aiming to produce in our document a draft of what we're now, in the last 5 minutes, calling the DART framework. That will be a self-assessment framework that will allow a researcher or an institution or a research program manager and a funder to actually make assessments of where are we in terms of openness, where could we go, and where do we want to go? And those are the 3 important questions that an evaluative framework like the one we're proposing allows you to answer. That document, we hope, will be open for comments, and we'll get feedback on that, and then we would like to see potentially in the future this coming together to be an OSI document that actually helps all stakeholders chart their path through the landscape of open. So that pretty much concludes what I wanted to say, but as it was pointed out yesterday on Twitter, that we do have 4 dimensions of open, which means I have to leave you with the 4-dimensional hypercube of openness. Thank you very much.